Placed for hearing to consider a resolution amending the water quality control plan for the Sacramento River and San Joaquin River basins to establish salinity objectives for the lower San Joaquin River. The board conducted a hearing to receive oral comments regarding the proposed basin plan amendment on April 6, 2017. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and the meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. This time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. All persons expecting to testify, please stand at this time, raise your right hand, and take the following oath. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer, I do. Thank you. Following the staff presentation, interested persons may speak for 3 minutes each, and a timer will be used. Please state your name, address, and affiliation before speaking. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
Two quick legal matters. One, we received a late comment from San Francisco Baykeeper. The comment mirrored comments and referenced comments that had been previously raised by other interested persons. We consulted with the board chair. The board chair said that it would be okay and clearly not prejudicial to add this to the administrative record. We did so, and staff have provided a response. That document should be available at the table, and I believe copies have already been distributed to you. And lastly, there's a comment that came in via email, asked that it be read into the oral comments at the hearing from Debbie Webster of Civiqua because she was not able to make it. I think that's a little bit of a stretch to ask that a written comment be read in, but let me just say on the record that generally it expresses appreciation for the regional board's efforts, their commitment to the stakeholder process, clarifications made, and expresses thanks to the regional board staffs.
Thank you. Thank you. With that, we're ready to go with the staff presentation.
Speak aloud.
You got to turn on the...
I had it off earlier because
Okay.
Good morning, Chairman Longley and members of the board. My name is Ann Littlejohn. I'm a senior environmental scientist here in the Rancho Cordova office, and I have taken the oath. I'm here today regarding the proposed basin plan amendment to establish salinity water quality objectives for the lower San Joaquin River. At the April board hearing, staff presented in detail the background on this project and the development of project alternatives by the Lower San Joaquin River Stakeholder Committee. Today, I will first provide a brief overview of the basin plan amendments for the preferred alternative, including the proposed water quality objectives and the implementation program. In addition, I will touch on the overall findings of the scientific peer review and the environmental and economic analyses. However, the main portion of my presentation will be focused on the public comments we received and staff's responses, including any proposed revisions to either the amendment itself or the staff report. I will then conclude the presentation with staff's recommendation. As we discussed at the April meeting, the Salt and Boron Control Program for the Lower San Joaquin River, which was adopted by the board in 2004 and approved by US EPA in 2006, was developed in response to requirements of the State Water Board Rights Decision 1641, and it's made up of 2 phases. The first phase of the control program manages discharges to meet the Vernalis salinity objectives, while also meeting our agency's goal of maximizing the export of salt through the river and out of the basin. Phase 2 of the control program, which is the subject of the amendments before you today, meets the requirement of Decision 1641 to establish salinity water quality objectives upstream of Vernalis, and it also limits the need for dilution water releases from New Melones Reservoir to ensure meeting the Vernalis objectives. I'm going to take a quick break.
Hey, Dr. Longley. Can
Can we take a 5-minute break? This we need to update the presentation with a newer version, evidently.
Taking it out yesterday.
Okay.
This isn't the one. My apologies. Multiple copies. Let's try again. I think this was the slide. Did I finish this? I don't think so. Okay. My apologies.
Not a problem.
Multiple versions. Pick the wrong one. The goals of this Phase 2 effort are to establish upstream water quality objectives from Vernalis to the mouth of the Merced River that are protective of all beneficial uses in the river, including agricultural, irrigation supply, and the municipal and domestic supply, or MUN use. There is currently no numeric salinity objective in the basin plan for the protection of agriculture. Electrical conductivity, or EC criteria for the lower San Joaquin River were derived using the Hoffman soil salinity model. The model was used to establish irrigation EC concentrations that are protective of almonds, which is the most salt-sensitive common crop in the watershed. The Title 22 secondary maximum contaminant levels for salinity, which the basin plan references as protective of the MUN use, were also considered during the development of these proposed objectives. In addition to adopting salinity objectives protective of beneficial uses, the proposed amendments must also ensure that the existing boron water quality objectives in the lower San Joaquin River are met. The proposed amendments fulfill the goals of Phase 2 of the Salt and Boron Control Program. The proposed amendments fulfill the goals of the Phase 2 of the Salt and Boron Control Program by establishing a 1,550 microsiemen per centimeter electrical conductivity water quality objective as a 30-day running average, except during extended dry periods, when the objective will be 2,470 microsiemens per centimeter as a 30-day running average, and 2,200 microsiemens per centimeter as an annual average. Also being proposed is a 1,350 microsiemen per centimeter EC performance goal with specific seasonal and water year considerations. These concentrations are an improvement of existing water quality in the river. To ensure that the proposed EC water quality objectives can be achieved, an implementation program was developed with consideration given to potential salinity management actions in the watershed. Water quality monitoring results indicate that the proposed EC water quality objectives can be consistently achieved after implementation of the planned management actions in the watershed. This includes the full implementation of the Grassland Bypass project by the end of 2019, and other management activities like the installation of drip irrigation systems. Therefore, no additional implementation management actions are being proposed for this basin plan amendment. However, the implementation program does include a monitoring and surveillance program at 2 key locations: Crow's Landing, which is downstream of the Merced River tributary, and Maze Road, which is downstream of the Tuolumne River and upstream of the Stanislaus River. The monitoring program will ensure planned activities are implemented and water quality objectives for the proposed EC water quality objectives and existing boron water quality objectives are met. Over the next decade, there are a number of other activities in the watershed that may impact water quality conditions in the river, such as the San Joaquin River Restoration Project and proposed changes to the flow objectives for the Bay Delta. So the implementation program also includes a basin plan reopener clause after 10 years after adoption of the amendments to give the board a chance to evaluate monitoring data and any new scientific information collected during this period to assess the attainment of the water quality objectives and performance goal and evaluate whether or not any additional changes need to be made to the program. The full basin plan amendment package includes the results from an independent scientific peer review and findings from an environmental, anti-degradation, and economic analyses. Comments from 3 scientific peer reviews indicate that in general, this project utilized sound science and concepts to develop and evaluate proposed salinity objectives. However, recommendations were made that future evaluations consider other salinity models and new information, especially pertaining to crop sensitivity data and leaching fractions. Staff agrees with these recommendations, and the basin plan reopener period will be an opportunity to reassess the available information. The CEQA and environmental analysis of the proposed objectives presented in the staff report concludes that there would not be any significant impacts as a result of implementing these proposed amendments. The staff report demonstrates that salinity concentrations in the lower San Joaquin River are expected to improve over the historical baseline with the proposed water quality objectives. In addition, the proposed amendments are consistent with state and federal anti-degradation policies, and the board will still require dischargers to implement best practical treatment or control of their waste to limit degradation, and to make findings that any degradation caused by discharges will adhere to the maximum benefit of the people of the state. Lastly, the economic analysis indicates the associated costs of these proposed amendments are minimal due to the reliance on planned implementation actions in the watershed. During the April 6th hearing, we received oral comments from both the public and the board members. Oral comments of support were received from David Corey and Karna Herigfeld, who represent the San Joaquin Valley Drainage Authority and the Stockton East Water District, respectively. And they are also the co-chairs of the Lower San Joaquin River Committee. Oral comments were also received from the Central Valley Clean Water Association. The main issue that came out of these comments had to do with basin plan language pertaining to NPDES discharges to the lower San Joaquin River. And since these comments were also reflected in their written comments, I will address them shortly. The board also provided oral comments to staff, and these included direction to solicit input from state and federal fisheries agencies to ensure that the proposed salinity objectives are consistent with their efforts to protect fish habitat. The board also directed Central Valley Water Board staff to coordinate with other programs in the basin, such as the San Joaquin River Restoration Program and the Bay Delta programs. Lastly, the board asked staff to address potential climate change impacts on this project. In response to comments pertaining to the outreach and coordination with other groups, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife staff have participated in the Lower San Joaquin River Committee stakeholder meetings and reviewed the proposed amendments. The Water Quality Coordinator for the Mid-Pacific region of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation was also an active participant in both the Lower San Joaquin River Committee and the San Joaquin River Restoration Program, which is tasked with restoring the native salmon in the river. State board staff working on the Bay Delta Plan updates participated in the Lower San Joaquin River committee meetings. And Central Valley Water Board staff also regularly participate in Bay Delta efforts and have discussed these proposed amendments throughout their development. In addition to the ongoing coordination with fisheries agencies through the Lower San Joaquin River committee meetings, Central Valley Water Board staff reached out to specific staff from the state and federal fish and wildlife agencies, as well as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, to solicit feedback on these amendments. However, we did not receive back any written comments. With regard to climate change, the staff report does discuss its potential impacts, such as more frequent and extended dry periods. To address potential impacts, water quality objectives are adjusted during extended dry periods to allow dischargers more flexibility to reuse and conserve limited water resources, which typically increase salinity concentrations. The April board hearing was held during the public comment period. So next I'd like to discuss the written comments we received during this time frame. Staff received 11 letters during the public comment period that ended on April 14th of this year. These letters are included in your agenda packet and came from a variety of stakeholders, including federal and state agencies, several water and irrigation districts, point source dischargers, and one joint letter from the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance, California Water Impact Network, Aqua Alliance, Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Association, Institute of Fisheries Resources, and the Environmental Water Caucus. 2 letters were also received during the CV Salt's Central Valley-wide Salt and Nitrate Management Plan review period that contained comments relating to these amendments. These were from the California Urban Water Users and the South Delta Water Agency. And as mentioned earlier, we also received one late written comment letter from the San Francisco Baykeeper. The response to comments document that is provided in your agenda packet contains over 60 specific comments and staff's responses. The comment types fell into 3 general categories: editorial, policy, and scientific. For today's presentation, I'm only hitting on the broad issues that came from multiple commenters and or led to edits or revisions in the draft staff report or the proposed basin plan language. These issues are as follows. The first is the impact of the proposed objectives on water quality in the Delta. The second is the impact these amendments would have on New Melones Reservoir dilution flows. The third is the choice of the Hoffman soil salinity model for deriving salinity criteria protective of the AGR beneficial use. The fourth is the choice of a 15% leaching fraction model parameter used with the Hoffman model. The fifth was the adequacy of the aquatic life beneficial use review provided in the draft staff report. And lastly, the proposed basin plan language used in consideration of the NPDES discharges to the river. So the first broad issue is concern on the impact these proposed upstream water quality objectives will have on the Vernalis salinity objectives, and subsequently the impact to water quality in the South Delta. Staff's response to this issue is that phase 1 of the salt and borne control program will not change the objective or the requirements of the Vernalis salinity water quality objectives, which are protective of beneficial uses in the South Delta. Therefore, the establishment of these water quality objectives will not impact the South Delta because the Vernalis objectives will continue to be met as they have since 1995. Any concern regarding the appropriateness of the water quality objectives established for Vernalis need to be addressed by the State Board as part of the Bay Delta Basin Plan updates. The second broad issue was concerned that the proposed water quality objectives will require the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation to increase dilution flows from the new Malones Reservoir to meet Vernalis salinity objectives. Staff's response is that compared to baseline conditions, modeled forecast of future salinity in the lower San Joaquin River is expected to decrease with the full implementation of the preferred alternative, which includes the full implementation of the Grassland Bypass Project. The Grassland Bypass Project is progressively reducing subsurface return flows to the lower San Joaquin River from 90,000 acres of irrigated agriculture. Non-stormwater flows to the lower San Joaquin River from the Grassland Bypass Project will cease at the end of 2019. The draft staff report in Section 5 presents a modeling analysis using the new Malones operational model that predicts that the proposed upstream water quality objectives will result in no change or a net decrease in the number and volume of dilution flows from the new Malones Reservoir needed to meet the Vernalis salinity objectives. The third broad issue had to do with concern that the steady state Hoffman model used to evaluate the protection of the agricultural irrigation supply beneficial use was not adequate for predicting soil salinity. Staff's response is that the Lower San Joaquin River Committee reviewed many different models for developing the water quality salinity criteria for the Lower San Joaquin River, and ultimately chose the Hoffman model because it was the only applicable model at the time that had been peer reviewed, and it had already been applied in the Delta in 2010. As discussed earlier, Central Valley Water Board staff submitted scientific aspects of these amendments to an independent peer review, and 3 peer review scientists found the science and concepts of the Hoffman model for use in calculating the protective salinity criteria to be sound. Peer reviewers did note that new models are under development and recommended review of these models and any additional crop salt sensitivity information during future evaluations. Staff will use the Basin Plan reopener provision to consider available models and any new crop sensitivity information.
I have to concur with your conclusions on the Hoffman model. Certainly, it's the best model for use that we currently have in this area. I think I know Jim's aware of the work that Nigel Quinn is doing. Jim Brownell sitting here at the table. That Nigel Quinn's doing, that work really works off the Hoffman, it makes it into a dynamic model. It's about, I sign off on the vouchers on it every month. As I recall, we're about 95% done on it. But I think that that model needs to be considered, put through peer review once it's ready to see if it, in fact, can give us a model that's going to have all the good attributes of the Hoffman model, but be able to do it in real time, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
The fourth broad issue pertained to concern that the 15% leaching fraction, which was a parameter used in the Hoffman model, was not appropriate for the lower San Joaquin River area. Leaching fraction is the percent of water draining past the root zone, and this figure shows that not all of the applied water will be taken up by the plant, and a certain fraction will drain past the root zone. As the leaching fraction increases, the salinity of the soil in the root zone decreases as salts are flushed down to the deeper soil depths. Staff recognizes that the leaching fraction can vary greatly, especially between different soil types and irrigation methods. But 15% was a reasonable input given the data that was available and based on input made by irrigators, water purveyors, members of local resource conservation districts, and other Lower San Joaquin River Committee stakeholders with knowledge of farming practices in the basin. As with the last issue, the reopener period will allow Central Valley Water Board staff to evaluate any new data pertaining to farming practices and associated leaching fractions within the Lower San Joaquin River Basin. The fifth broad issue is the concern that the aquatic life review presented in the draft staff report was too limited to evaluate the salinity impacts on fish migration and spawning of striped bass, sturgeon, American shad, and salmon. Staff agreed that additional information was needed in the aquatic life review portion of the staff report, and several sections were updated to include more information on historical salinity water quality, biological resources, and beneficial uses in the Lower San Joaquin River. In addition, the CEQA analysis was updated with clarification of the environmental baseline to better demonstrate the improvement in salinity concentrations in the river. These updates are presented in track changes versions of the staff report provided in your agenda package.
Go back to the previous slide, please. You're talking there about the staff report talked about historical salinity water quality. Could you address the salinity characteristics of the delta pre-dam? In other words, pre-1940?
I'm going to let Jeannie take that one.
Oh, gee, thank you. Jean Chilcott, Basin Planning Program Manager here in the office, and I have taken the oath. We didn't go back that far when we were doing our review. We went back to the time period when the water projects were initiated back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and reviewed the Bay Delta Plan and their work, where they were reviewing the impacts on the Delta, the increasing salinity levels that they saw, the water management changes, and identified where they had created cross channels and how they were moving the Sacramento River water in order to identify and preserve areas for specifically striped bass spawning, which was the most sensitive to salinity. But unfortunately, I do not have a response to you on what the Delta conditions were before those projects started.
And that's in the record, by the way, on the hearings held back in the 80s.
Yeah.
But good, we can talk about that later. Thank you.
The amended staff report provides additional information on biological resources within the Lower San Joaquin River, including information on key fish species in the basin. The discussion recognizes the historic significance of the Lower San Joaquin River and its tributaries for supporting migration and spawning of fish, and the documented decline in the fisheries after the development and completion of the water management projects in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The discussion also notes that while migration of all species continues, striped bass only migrate into the Lower San Joaquin River during the wettest years, and that the run of striped bass is small, even under ideal conditions. The 1991 Bay Delta Plan identifies primary striped bass spawning in the area of Prisoners Point, which is downstream of the project area. This area receives flows through the McCullummy River system, which receives Sacramento River water through the Delta Cross Canal near Walnut Grove, and provides high-quality water to the Prisoners Point area, especially during the spring months. The 1991 Bay Delta Plan acknowledged that not setting similar objectives in the reach of the river upstream of Prisoners Point effectively establishes a barrier to adult migration and spawning further upstream in the San Joaquin River. The Fisheries Review also noted sturgeon and shad as being generally more tolerant of salinity. And while white sturgeon have been found to migrate and spawn in the lower San Joaquin River, green sturgeon have not been identified in the river above Vernalis. Studies tracking migration patterns have identified the green sturgeon, and in particular their spawning habitat, as being contained within the delta and the Sacramento River Basin. No additional information on the salinity impacts of salmon migration was included, since documented impacts were primarily linked to flow and temperature and not salinity. The staff report also provides additional clarification that the CEQA environmental analysis was conducted based on a consideration of water quality conditions that have occurred in the lower San Joaquin River since 1996. This timeline was selected because the Grassland Bypass Project was initiated in September 1996 and was the last major hydrologic modification of the lower San Joaquin River, following the creation of the major water projects from the 50s and 60s. This time period also captures the lower salinity levels and improved water quality within the river that have resulted since the project was initiated. Modeled implementation to meet proposed salinity water quality objectives are based on planned salinity management activities in the watershed, including the completion of the Grassland Bypass Project in 2019. And they demonstrate a significant improvement of salinity water quality over historic conditions. Based on the review of the historic water management and quality within and surrounding the lower San Joaquin River, along with current biological resource information and the expectation of improving water quality conditions, staff finds that the proposed salinity objectives and implementation strategy are appropriate, reasonably protect migration and warm water spawning, and have no impact to biological resources. However, staff recognizes that the water and fisheries management within the basin are under review with potential development of flow objectives to protect beneficial uses in the delta and the ongoing San Joaquin River Restoration Program. The Basin Plan Reopener period will also allow staff to evaluate any new data pertaining to biological resources in the lower San Joaquin River Basin. The last broad issue has to do with proposed basin plan language pertaining to NPDES discharges to the lower San Joaquin River. The dischargers were requesting that the basin plan language provide specific options for meeting the upstream salinity objectives. However, there was also concern from other stakeholders that this language needs to be clear that the options do not replace the requirements of Phase 1 of the Salt and Boron Control Program to meet the Vernalis objectives. A late revision option was presented at the April 6 board hearing that provided specific options for NPDES dischargers for meeting the requirements of the proposed upstream objectives, such as considering the available dilution of the effluent in the receiving water. This late revision was chosen to replace the original proposed language in the draft staff report. An additional language was also added to this section to clarify that the upstream water quality objectives are in addition to and not replacing the requirements set forth in Phase 1's Vernalis Salinity Control Program. In summary, this slide shows the main sections of the staff report and basin plan language that were revised based on comments we received since the April hearing. In the staff report, staff revised Section 2 to provide more information on the historic salinity water quality. Section 4 was revised to provide an additional review of the fish spawning and migration in the river. And Appendix F had edits provided to clarify the environmental baseline used for CEQA analysis. In the basin plan language, clarifying edits were made to the NPDES consideration section as described in the last slide. This slide shows our next steps and timeline. Today, the board will consider adopting this basin plan amendment. If it is adopted today, we would anticipate a state board hearing by the end of this year, followed by an Office of Administrative Law and US EPA approval by mid-2018. The Grassland Bypass project is set to be completed by the end of 2019, and therefore these objectives will be implemented starting January 1st, 2020. Based on this projected timeline, the basin plan reopener would be in 2028, 10 years after the basin plan amendments are fully adopted.
It's probably needless for me to ask this question, knowing the confidence of the folks I'm talking to, but I assume that this has been fully staffed with US EPA, Region 9.
We have been in discussions with US EPA Region 9 staff and their planning department approximately quarterly for the last 2.5 years.
Good, good. Thank you. That's just like suspenders. It gives me comfort.
Do they make those anymore? No. At this time, I would like to ask the board to include the staff presentation into the record and adopt the resolution that approves the staff report and its supporting environmental documentation, along with the revisions, and adopts this basin plan amendment into the water quality control plan for the Sacramento River Basin and the San Joaquin River Basin.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. Questions, comments?
Glad I found the right one.
Seeing none, we'll go to the interested persons. I have a card from John Herrick. Morning, John. I've seen you. You're very patient. You sat out there all morning listening to us talk about timber and other things.
Thank you, John Herrick for South Delta Water Agency. As you can see on my card, I've requested a few additional minutes because I do have a PowerPoint. I will go as quickly as possible, but I do think something as important as this warrants a little extra time, if you don't mind.
How much time do you anticipate?
I think I can be done within 10 minutes, and I'll go as quickly as I can.
That is fine. That's great.
Thank you. Let me start.
Go ahead.
Again, I'm John Herrick for the South Delta Water Agency, and the upstream standards or objectives being considered today don't specifically apply to the region I'm in, but because they're upstream, it's part of the whole process by which we're trying to protect beneficial uses up and down the river all the way through the delta. Anyway, I'm here today to criticize the use of the Hoffman model, and I think I can put that in fairly basic terms. We'll see if that works or not. What am I clicking on? There it is. Thank you. The proposed basin plan, as you've heard, is supposed to establish water quality objectives of 1,500 EC and 2,400 EC under certain circumstances. And they're based upon Dr. Glenn Hoffman's work. Now, I've referenced the Hoffman report, which was submitted to the state board for its evaluation of the Bay Delta standards. But the Hoffman report includes a lot of the same information used here, and of course the model used to calculate leaching fractions and impacts are the same. Now, I want to make sure you understand that the proposed objectives here that are being proposed aren't based upon any new study of the area for water quality or drainage. They're based upon inputs to this Hoffman model. Now, I've been telling the state board this for 2010 reports, so that's almost 7 years without anybody listening to me, so don't be discouraged if you don't believe me either. I don't know if that's the right way to put that. But the Hoffman report, the methods that he used are not reliable scientifically. And so I'll try to go through some of those. As we've said, the Hoffman report for the Delta, not for here, but for the Delta, had a draft that was completed in 2010. Now, at its basics, the model tries to calculate what's going on in the soil profile. So you have salt in, and that's the salt that's in the applied water. That applied water then goes to the roots, the dirt, the root zone. And the plant uses water but not salt. And so the question is, how much salt comes out at the end? It doesn't really come out at the end. Sometimes it just gets pushed down the ground. But how much comes? So it's salt in, salt out. Now, the problem with what Hoffman did, whether or not his model works, Dr. Hoffman assumed the water quality. Now, you can't assume a number and have that reflect reality or use it for predicting the future or for establishing water quality objectives, in my opinion. Now, this is just table 3.10 from his report that I referenced, and just in the table there in the very beginning it says assuming applied water of 0.7. Now, he did another category there of 0.5, which is better water quality, but anyway, he just assumed the water quality. There's no doubt about that. Now, for the salt out, Dr. Hoffman used tile drainage data. Now, a tile drain is a fixed, I'll say pipeline, in the ground below the root zone that has holes in it, it's perforated, so that water will flow into that and then it will drain out and they can either pump it somewhere or do something, but it's made to keep water levels from rising above the drain. It won't always work, but that's what it does. The problem is, here are the drains that he used, some of the drains he used for his data, and you can see the city of Tracy there. The next slide helps you to see where those drains are. They're in that southwest corner, so to speak, of the South Delta. They're not in the heart of the South Delta, which experiences all the problems. Anyway, the tile drain water in this area is collecting groundwater. It's not collecting necessarily or only the excess applied water that moves through the soil, so you could see how much of the salt was flushed out. So he's sampling, or he used data that samples a source of salt or existing salt that we don't know where all the salt came from. Now, anecdotally, everybody in the area tells me that we have bad groundwater there. We have bad groundwater everywhere in the South Delta. So I'm just telling you that he's sampling salt sources as the salt out that aren't the result of what leached through the soil. It might be partly that, but it's not that. So what does that mean? When you observe salt out, which is not reflective of what passed through the soil, and you've assumed the applied soil salts, or the applied salts in the water, you're not coming up with anything that means anything. It's an exercise in mathematics. It's not an evaluation of what's going on. Now, that's the Hoffman report for the Delta. That's not what's going on here. But the point I'm trying to make is, if you're going to establish a water quality standard, you have to figure out what salt is indeed passing through the soil profile in any particular area, how much is collecting there, and then you can calculate from a model what changes in what changes in applied water salinity might affect, the soil profile, and then develop a standard. But you can't do it backwards. You can't just do a calculation and say that is protective, because you don't have any of the inputs that you need. Now, because of this, we think, fatal flaw in Dr. Hoffman's report and his approach, we commissioned Michelle Leinfelder-Miles, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, who did a study for us. And she found that salt was accumulating in the soil profile, not being leached out. Now, this is hard to read. This is the summary, one of the summary pages from her report, and you can see, the next slide will show it better, but she finds some leaching fractions of 2 and 3%, not 15 or 20%, like Dr. Hoffman concluded in his Delta report. So Dr. Hoffman took assumed water quality for applied, an output of water quality that was not reflective of what goes to the soil, and told us then what leaching was happening in the area. Then a scientist does a study and finds, no, those numbers are significantly wrong. So here are the numbers. As you can see in Dr. Hoffman's column there on the left, he's got leaching fractions up to 33%. There's a low there of 11, I think, somewhere. But Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' study, again, shows the leaching fractions of 2, there is a 21 and a 25, but 2, 3, 7, 6%. Those are monumental differences when you're trying to evaluate what's going on. So the point I want to make is, whether or not the model works, give it inputs, tell it what leaching fraction is going to happen, Whether or not the model works is irrelevant to this process because the model can't tell you what's going on. The model estimates outputs based upon the inputs you've given it. And so the regional board has been, no offense to you, has been charged with developing these upstream standards since 2000. And these will be implemented in 2020. D1641 was 2000. The only people who have done a survey, a test to see what's actually happening in any particular soil area is the South Delta, hiring Michelle Leinfelder-Miles, who's our ag extension rep for the county. Nothing's been done to test the lands that are the subject of these standards to see, okay, well, how much salt are they putting on? How much salt is leaching through the soil profile? And how much salt is collecting in the soil profile? Because those facts would then allow someone to calculate a leaching fraction. Then you could plug that leaching fraction into Dr. Hoffman's model and then get real data input and real data input for the applied water and the drain water. None of those things have happened here. So whether or not the model correctly works, you know, when you plug it in and hit go, that's irrelevant to this because we're trying to determine what is protective of the beneficial use for ag. I don't have a clue what is protective of beneficial for ag in the areas of this program. I don't know anything about the soils, the management practices, or the applied water quality or the drain water quality for those areas upstream of Vernalis. Neither does this basin plan amendment. So I'm just cautioning you that, in my opinion, I don't think you should be making decisions based upon assumptions and model work when the only thing that determines what's actually happening is a study. Now, our study was over 3 years, and it cost us all of $40,000. I think it was 20 grand-ish each year. So the time and money that we collectively have spent in the last 20 years, 25 years trying to get this stuff done, and we still don't have the data to make a decision. So with that, I'm just telling you that's my opinion. I don't think you have a scientific basis to adopt these objectives, even though the model runs as constituted and will give you outputs depending upon the inputs you give it. Now, I finished with 14 seconds, and if you want information on the water quality of the Delta before the projects, I'm your man.
Not having extensive data with experience with the Hoffman model, but having some with salt models, I know this is a very complicated field, and inputs and outputs are not quite as simple as you imply. And I'd like to ask Mr. Brownell, Jim Brownell, Dr. Brownell, to make a reply.
Jim Brownell, and I've taken with the Central Valley Water Board, and I've taken the oath. There's a lot of things to reply here. Basically, we're looking at a study in a soil and a water table that's unlike the area in question, the Lower San Joaquin River Basin. The soils studied were fairly low permeability soils that are not common, if at all, in the Lower San Joaquin River Basin. The actual leaching fraction in the basin is based on not only the studies that Mr. Herrick mentioned, but also other studies. And even possibly more importantly, based on the collective knowledge of many people who farm and provide water in the Lower San Joaquin River Basin. I think that Mr. Herrick is not really criticizing from my take, not really criticizing the model so much as the input to the model, the leaching fraction. And we do believe that the leaching fraction is a good middle ground, not giving other more specific data or newer studies. We do have a lot of new data on the water quality. I think he mentioned that we didn't have water quality data. Well, we certainly do. So with that, I have a lot more I could say. In fact, I could point out I want to point out one more thing. In the study that Mr. Herrick mentions, it states in that study, perhaps I should read from it. It can be difficult to apply enough water to meet the ET and the leaching requirement to maintain yields, particularly on low permeability soils like those in the South Delta. I think the primary difference here is that the low permeability soils are not the soils we have in the lower San Joaquin River Basin. Also, this study measured leaching fraction, but didn't measure the leaching fraction that may be possible with farming practices. In other words, for example, adding more water can increase your leaching fraction up to a point. You don't want it to pond and run off. But there's more work to be done. I'm not disputing. I think this study was very good, but there's a lot more work that could be done to confirm, I think, what this study is suggesting.
If I may, and then I'll shut up. I don't mean to, I know you don't want to back and forth, but the doctor's comments, I think, prove my point, because Dr. Hoffman was fully aware and fully described the soils in the South Delta and was fully confident in making his conclusions and determinations. I'm not telling you that the model won't give you an output upstream. I'm telling you that in the example of Dr. Hoffman using his model, knowing all these other factors, he came up with leaching fractions that were a factor of 10 off of what was actually happening. So I'm just trying to tell you that whatever assumptions, whatever common knowledge, whatever's been used, you haven't done any study that tells you what actual leaching fractions are happening in the area. So again, I apologize. I appreciate your
This is a
allowing
very
me to talk.
complicated subject, and quite frankly, we would need probably a 5-day conference if that's enough to be able to go through the science in this. It's complicated. Let me put it at that, and it's very site specific. And I think you were making the point, Jim, about the site specific part of it, the difference in soil types and so forth.
Dr. Longley?
Yes.
Can I, a couple points I wanted to clarify
Sure.
for the board. One is, I think Jim brought up a page of that study that had I think a really good point. Also on that study, it does recognize that 15% is a good general rule of thumb in agricultural systems, which is the leaching fraction we're using. And that was actually on one of the slides that he brought. And it further goes on to say that it may not be appropriate for the Delta, but that the 15% is appropriate for agricultural systems in general. Another thing is, and I'd maybe like to ask Jeannie or staff to comment on, is one comment by Mr. Herrick was that we have done no research in trying to figure out what the actual leaching fractions in our area is. And while I believe we haven't, gone out and actually done studies throughout the area, I do remember seeing some information in the staff report of how we looked into this with local irrigators and also others in the area. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, this is Jean Chilcutt. I was going to bring that point up as well. We did do some initial study, and as John recognized, it's extremely variable. And in fact, part of our response to broad issue number 4 shows that variability, ranging potentially from 13% to 84%. So the lower leaching fraction that you use, the more conservative your model is. And we looked at that data, looked at the report and the standard use of a 15%, but then we went a step further because we recognize that the model's a tool. It's not the final say in what your water quality objective is going to be. It's going to give you a range. It's going to give you some criteria. It gives you a scientific basis, and then you continue working off of that to determine what the appropriate objective is. And there was one comment that John said that we haven't found a number that's protective of agriculture. And I really do dispute that particular comment because we use the model as a tool to come up with a number, but we also used the Lower San Joaquin River Stakeholder Committee, and we specifically reached out to the growers that were diverting the water and are actually using the water. And we vetted all the inputs in the Hoffman model with those growers, as well as the outputs. And we asked them what was achievable. Does this make sense? Is this a good number to use to represent the area, knowing the diversity in the area? And they concurred with it. So we feel that we came up with numbers and a range and a process that truly is protective of the AGR use, irrigated agricultural supply, because we were asking the people that actually use the water whether or not it meets their needs. So that's one point that I wanted to make.
Well, John, like I said, we can go on, and other board members can ask you to respond if they so desire. But quite frankly, I have to put my faith with staff. It's more than faith. I've looked at the work they've been doing, and I have to concur with the process. Bob?
Yeah, I think this was, for me, is a pretty key question. And I wanted to ensure that there was good documentation in our replies to this question. And I think there was some written that on page 4 of the response to comments, is that what you pulled out? But also, I really appreciate what you just said, Jeannie, in terms of how the model was evaluated and reviewed specific to this Basin Plan Amendment, in terms of what the inputs were and the outputs were as addressing some form of verification of the numbers that were chosen. So what I heard you saying was, yes, we looked at this model, but that was not all we looked at. We assessed if this was really happening in the real world, if these numbers made sense, and the answer that you as staff came up with, yes, these numbers make sense for this Basin Plan Amendment and what we're trying to achieve here. Is that an accurate representation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. No, thank you now.
Any other board member input? Yes, Carmen, go ahead.
So I was interested in Mr. Herrick's point about how whether tile drainage was the right measurement, and I've because of a field trip I took with David Corey, I saw how this works and how tile drainage works. And so, yeah, if it's coming from the top, then that makes sense. If it's coming from the bottom up to try to keep water from rising all the way up, then I think Mr. Herrick has a point. So how is is the criticism of the Hoffman method as to tile drainage, is that valid?
Well, the tile drainage study was only part of many things that were looked at. We didn't depend on those studies to conclude that 15% was the correct number or the best number to use. As I said before, there were other studies done, as well as the leaching fraction was vetted with the people that do the irrigation.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that the Hoffman model was used as sort of a rubric, but was not, the numbers from that are not what was taken into this. Is that right?
I think what your question is does the Hoffman model calculate the leaching fraction? The leaching fraction's an input. The study that Hoffman did in the Delta, he described his process for coming up with the leaching fraction. We tried a similar process, and that's where we found that huge range of potential leaching fractions. And I do think you're correct. I think using subsurface tile drainage that represents the groundwater certainly reduces the confidence in the type of number that you're getting. If that's accurate, it's more appropriate to really do a much more detailed study to really focus, somehow measuring exactly what's come out of the root zone, which is, as Jim said, why we didn't rely on that number. It does reduce your confidence if that's the only value you're using and you just plug that into the model.
Any further comments? Thank you. And you will be evaluating other models as they become available. John, I'm going to give you a minute if you want to wrap up. Don't walk off.
And I would suggest if we want to give them a minute, which is fine with me, but maybe we should hear the other speakers and then John could comment because it might be,
There's only one other speaker.
well, then, it's David. I'm wondering if we want to hear from David and give John another minute at that point. Does that make sense, or?
I can finish now if you'd like.
Go ahead.
Yep.
Nothing that anybody has said here is wrong, but we're supposed to be concentrating on the science supporting it. Okay, so I don't distrust, I don't even know the farmers against which this data was compared. But you'll notice what was not said. What was not said was the farmers know what leaching they're getting in their fields, because they don't. Maybe somewhere someone does. It's not scientific to say we used 15% leaching fraction and we talked to somebody and they said, yeah, we think that's appropriate. That's not science. Now, I'm not trying to be mean, I'm not trying to be nasty, but what we need is to know what's going on before you can use the model to calculate changes, how much can, what'll happen if this is that poor quality water. But talking to somebody is not the same thing as going out and having a study that says, we applied this much remained in the soil, and that much left the soil. That's all I have to say. I appreciate everybody's consideration and giving me extra time. And
You,
I know
you
have a
got your
difficult job.
comments on the record, John.
Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Chair Longley, members of the board, David Corey representing the San Joaquin Valley Drainage Authority, and also here on behalf of the Lower San Joaquin River Committee, and Karna Herrick, co-chair, is in the back. I think the only committee members who are here at the moment.
John's a member.
John's a member, he is. He's a member, yeah. Kind of tailed off there at the end, but he's a member, yeah. So anyway, we just appreciate, the staff's efforts in putting this together, and also sort of having the ability to go through the stakeholder process. It was long, and as I've said in the past, they are difficult and time consuming. But we did work with John, we worked with the water users on the San Joaquin River. We addressed these issues of what's the right model to use, which is, Hoffman or other models, and what is the best tool given what we have resources at hand and what's been peer reviewed and those sorts of things. And we came to the conclusion that the Hoffman was, in fact, the most appropriate model to use. Dennis Westcott, who was very involved in this process throughout it, certainly understands those models better than I do, and he concurred that what we were doing made sense. In terms of outreach to stakeholders, we did include those large major irrigation districts that use the water off the San Joaquin River in this reach. And not only did we just ask them, but because this was an archetype of CV salts, we utilized some of this Saline Coalition's funds to allow them to interact and discuss the issue with an agronomist, with John Dickey, so that they could fully understand and make sure that they understood the ramifications of the Hoffman model and those inputs, and make sure that they had the resources to be able to make those determinations. So it wasn't just call up and say, hey, you think this is okay? We did significant more outreach than that, and they were comfortable with the assessments we've made. So anyway, I think this is an excellent outcome that we come from the stakeholder process. Early on, I think I've said this before, I felt this would be, that we would end up with Karna and I be on different sides of lawsuits over this issue. But because of the stakeholder process, we actually came to something that works for everybody. And, it does have the reopener so that if we got something wrong, we can address it at that point. So I don't know if you have any questions. I'm here to answer.
Any questions for David? I think one of the points you got across, if I heard you right, is your process was extensive.
It definitely was. Yeah, we had a lot of heated discussions throughout this, and you guys can be the beneficiaries of that, in that you didn't have to hear all of that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Certainly. Turn your card in, please. Come to the microphone and introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Regina Chicazola. I represent the Pacific Coast Federation of Fisheries Association. I am sorry that I was late for this agenda item. I thought it was going to be happening later in the day and heard it on the webcast while I was watching and headed right over. I did comments with Bill Jennings, and if you have any questions on our comments, Bill Jennings or Tom Stokely would be better people to ask, as they know far more about this issue. But we do not support this Basin Plan amendment. We believe there should be further studies and a full supplemental environmental document that looks at aquatic impacts to a greater extent. We cannot support doubling of salinity standards during certain times of year, and I have engaged in the sea salts process and have brought up issues of having actually lower discharges and not instead of changing standards. Unfortunately, because we do not have a lot of money as a fishermen's organization, we cannot engage to the level we would like. But we do feel like this needs to be further looked at. We don't think that the anti-degradation analysis is adequate. We don't feel that the aquatic life analysis is adequate. We don't think that the assimilative capacity of the lower San Joaquin was properly looked at. And we think that there's a lot of assumptions on the aquatic life and the impacts to aquatic life that are not correct, and that this is just not a protective proposal at this point. We think it needs to be looked at further, and that there needs to be a harder look at the science and how of the cumulative impacts and how this impacts fisheries and water quality within the lower San Joaquin and also the Delta. With that said, I would direct any questions to Bill Jennings or Tom Stokely, who have worked on the Grasslands bypass and the issues of salinity way more than I have. But I also would like, when you're considering salinity standards and increasing the allowances of salinity standards, to also understand that with agricultural discharges does not just come salinity, but also a lot more pollution. And so why we look at this is the salinity standards are being higher is not good for the aquatic community. It's also going to increase other chemicals and other water quality impairments. So thank you so much for allowing us to comment. We did do written comments. I just wanted to make sure that the board was aware that we don't support this. Thank you.
Thank you. What I heard was what I read in the comments provided by the organizations you are representing, and staff has replied to that, so I'm assuming that you don't agree with staff's response to those comments. Is that correct?
I have not read all of them myself since I'm not the point person on this, but yes, that is correct. Bill Jennings does not feel like that was adequate. The responses were adequate, and we still do not approve of the lowering of salinity standards.
Thank you. So briefly, could you address the comment, Jeannie?
Well, I'd like to
Because you've
address,
already they've already been gone through in the earlier presentation. Yeah.
I think the brief response to comments is that staff feels that the proposal we've put on the table will be improving water quality over baseline conditions. We did recognize the fact that we needed to add some additional information on aquatic life beneficial uses, the historic water quality and how that historic water quality and the construction of the projects in the 40s, 50s, and 60s have changed the dynamics in the system and have severely impacted the fisheries. We've been improving water quality over that baseline condition in the last several years, and in fact, we used the best water quality period after the Grassland Bypass Project's implementation, when it progressively began reducing salinity, as our baseline, specifically to use the best conditions we had and then move to improve even further from that. So we feel that this Basin Plan Amendment is succeeding in that aspect. We don't feel that we are providing degradation. We feel that we've satisfied the anti-degradation. And I will let Patrick add to that if there's anything specific he'd like to say about the anti-degradation piece of her comment.
Yeah, I think there's a couple comments that I could make regarding CEQA compliance and anti-degradation and other policy compliance, but I would suggest that my comments and legal advice would be more appropriately given after the close of the hearing while the board's in deliberations.
Very good. Any further comments by board members?
Carl, this is one of the questions I troubled over was the CEQA compliance. And it looks at, these are the baseline conditions and we're going to be better than that, therefore it's okay. And it doesn't really look at, this is my synopsis.
Yeah,
So,
Bob.
which may or may not be accurate.
Possibly, let me go ahead and close the hearing, and then we can talk with Patrick on your questions.
Well, I wanted to check in with Jeannie on this.
Okay.
So, and I understand that, and I see that, but it doesn't really look at, is this is the best it can be, and look at that alternative as, are there other alternatives here that we can do a better job at, or not? And I think we partially addressed that by the reopener. And what we often do in these situations is we look for opportunities to improve our science and our understanding so we can get there. But also in this, I mean, aquatic to me is not just the fish. And I've seen most of our focus is on the fisheries, but it's on the bugs that the fish eat or other things that help make the aquatic environment healthy. So this is, I'm a little bit uneasy about the CEQA compliance here. On the other hand, I guess what I'm looking to hear, aside from what Patrick might say, is do our staff and their professional opinion feel like this does adequately address the CEQA compliance requirements? And what I've heard is yes, it does, and we will have a better aquatic environment than we presently have. Is that?
Okay, you
Thank
had a
you. I'm
lot
a
of different
little muddled
questions
there,
in there.
but-
Let me try to kind of walk through it. So one of the questions is not just the focus on fish, but also the focus on the food that the fish eat. And what we found when we had gone back through our documentation is the white paper that was done by CV Salts looking specifically at aquatic life, that was really their focus. Their focus had been on the other assemblages and the potential impacts from salinity on those. And what they found is through the literature review that the salinity levels that would impact those assemblages were much higher than anything we would come out with for support, protecting irrigation supply or protecting municipal and domestic supply. When we looked further then at the fish, and that's why you see that injection of the information on the fish, we did find that it was the striped bass and the spawning of the striped bass that was sensitive to salinity, which is why we went back and looked at the historic conditions of the river and what the limitations were, and the fact that because of the changes in the system, the only time we came close to protecting striped bass and the criteria that was identified as protective for them was during extremely wet or flood years, or very, very high flood years. So we did look at a number of alternatives. I'm thinking there were 7 or 8 different alternatives, and some of those alternatives were to look at lower concentrations. The lowest we looked at wasn't the 440 or the 500 or 550 that the state board had recognized, but we did look at 1,000. And when we did the evaluation of 1,000, on the different water year types, we found that the only way we could find to meet that was to do reverse osmosis of the agricultural drainage and re-inject it into the river system. And even by doing that, the only time we could model the water quality, concentration, and salinity levels below 500 were still during the very wet years. So even at that level of implementation activity and need for the dischargers to do an excessive type of a reverse osmosis system, we were finding that it wasn't achievable in the system at this time. When you couple that with the fact that the way the Bay Delta Plan was adopted and their identification of a spawning habitat with certain water salinity objectives, and then upstream of that, higher salinity objectives and the recognition that that was creating a salinity barrier, we couldn't find the justification to try to push to that level. It didn't seem to be in the best interest of the people. We looked at the historic water quality. We feel that these numbers are improving over the historic. It still allows for the, better conditions during flood years, obviously, but it's not causing any additional limitations to the resource that's available and existing in the watershed. I think I caught most of your questions. Did I miss something?
I think that's pretty good. I do want to acknowledge, I think, in Ann's talk, I think you actually covered a lot of this, and I just think that your synopsis there helps me get it all in one place in my brain, so I appreciate both of those. Thank you. And the other thing you said, though, that I think was really important is we have a different river. I mean, and we're dealing with what we have, and I appreciate the work that all of the interest parties are doing in trying to have the best river we can have, so thank you.
Any further questions from board members? If not, then I'll close the hearing, and I'd like to hear from our counsel on the
specifically, I can address a
CEQA
couple
issue.
points. The first one is the concern from the environmental organizations, and as I mentioned at the onset of the hearing, CSPA, Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations, was joined by the San Francisco Baykeeper in requesting that the regional board prepare an environmental impact report or supplemental environmental document to address the potential changes, potential significant impacts that this planning action could possibly have on the physical environment in the lower San Joaquin. Now, I appreciate that concern. The terms of art are a little off. What we are doing here is a basin planning action. The basin planning actions are exempt from the CEQA requirement to prepare an environmental impact report. We prepare a staff report, and the staff report functions as the environmental impact report. So even though the terms of art are a little off, I want to address what we still have to address, the CEQA components in our staff report. And those are the big requirements of an environmental impact report are addressed in our staff report. And those are, one, you take a accounting of the environmental setting that your project is going to occur in. And in this case, we took a fairly thorough account of the environmental conditions in the lower San Joaquin. That's the environmental baseline that Jeannie was talking about. We recognized that there was downward trends in certain salinity due to the full build-out of the Grasslands Bypass project, which substantially reduces a lot of the salinity impacts to that portion of the river. We acknowledge that it isn't a pristine river. It's been subject to a tremendous amount of engineering over the last century. And so taking a look at those baseline conditions, we analyze the impacts that this project will have on those conditions. And the analysis concluded that this project will allow those downward trends, those improvements in water quality to continue. They, in fact, incentivize it to a degree. We recognize that the Grasslands Bypass project is going to be, is expected to be fully built out. And the staff report also functions to consider alternatives, and those alternatives include the reverse osmosis options that Jeannie talked about, an economic analysis of what those alternatives would be. Basically, how do we get that number down even lower? How could this basin plan action get that number down even lower? And it would be a number of reverse osmosis facilities which could have even more dramatic negative environmental impacts. We included a reopener provision in case a magic bullet to take things down even greater numbers is found in the next 10-year period or beyond. We can include that in a revision to the basin plan. And lastly, or two more items, as required in an environmental impact report, prior to the report being finalized, you have to consult with the agencies that exercise authority or have expertise in other areas. And those include the fisheries agencies, and those include all other agencies that have regulatory authority. And we were consulting, the board staff were consulting with the fisheries agencies, the federal agencies, and certainly this has to be approved by US EPA. They have to put their seal of approval that this amendment is backed by sound scientific evidence, that it's technically supportable, that it's consistent with the goals of the Clean Water Act, and then it's adequately protective of beneficial uses in this river. I think we've met all of those components in the staff report. We've justified why those are met. We certainly understand why a fisheries association or a sport fishermen's association would want even further reductions to improve quality in that river. I think we left the door open for that to potentially address that in the years to come if that's possible to do so. And lastly, I do think that the staff report has an adequate discussion of cumulative impacts of this action, trying to look forward and see what other regulatory actions that would tear off of this what the potential effect could be. And frankly, the situation would be that we'd continue to make the improvements that are being made in the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program and the Grasslands Bypass Project. And so those were all factored into the overall economic and environmental analysis contained in the staff report. Lastly, in terms of anti-degradation, there's a number of different issues that have to be addressed in anti-degradation. And I do think that that also takes into account the impact that this project has on baseline conditions. It also includes a factor that the board, when it actually authorizes discharge, when it reauthorizes NPDES permits or other types of permits authorizing discharges, we're not obliviating that requirement that the board has to walk through 6816 when authorizing those impacts. So suppose there was a new treatment or control technology, the magic bullet, we would not be overlooking that when we issue new permit approvals. And so, I mean, that's a long way of saying that I believe that the staff report has an adequate justification that the proposal is consistent with the anti-degradation policy as well.
And you're talking about a magic bullet. It may not be, in fact, a magic bullet. As we get into the S-salts phase, we may come up with other management strategies that, in fact, impact what we're doing here. So, with that said, is there any further discussion? Then I entertain a motion.
I'll move staff's recommendations.
And a second.
I'd be proud to second that
Bob.
motion.
Bob's moved, Carmen seconded. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Schneider, Ms. Ramirez, Ms. Brar,
Yes.
Dr. Markham,
No.
Dr. Longley,
Yes.
motion carries.
Thank you very much. And we are now adjourned until,
Ooh, there's one matter to be discussed in closed session.
okay.
It is a consideration of litigation. Closed session is authorized under Government Code 11126 Subdivision C to receive advice from legal counsel regarding pending litigation. The matter is listed as item G in the agenda, the Mount Diablo litigation.
Very good. Thank you. So we will go into closed session at the time we're eating lunch and discuss that one. Thank you. Jeannie?